Hello, I'm Dr. Winston York. I'm a software engineer, but I also have a strong interest in voting and voting systems. This fall, where I live, British Columbia is holding a referendum on whether to draw proportional representation in the place of first past the post for our voting system. I'm making this series of videos to help voters, particularly voters who, like myself, are conservative, make an informed decision about how to vote in this important referendum. This is not the first time BC's voted on adopting proportional representation. We had two previous referendums in 2005 and 2009 put forward by the BC Liberal governments on whether to adopt single transferable vote, or a form of proportional representation, as our voting system. Both of these referendums ended up going down to defeat, and we're today having a third one. And what I'm going to talk about today is the differences between the process used by the BC Liberals and the processes now being used by the BC NDP. When the Liberals came into power in 2001, they formed a citizens' assembly. They selected random people off of the voting rolls and put them into a citizens' assembly. And they investigated a number of different voting systems and eventually came out with their recommendation. So the entire process was designed to keep politicians at an arm's length from the process, so it wasn't politicians designing it. Instead, it was regular citizens who had simply taken the time to study all the different voting systems and come up with a good recommendation. There is no citizens' assembly this time around. Instead, the system is being influenced by what the politicians, particularly those from the Greens and the NDP, want. The full details of the system are going to be determined not by citizens directly, but by an all-party committee. So while the Liberals deliberately kept things at an arm's length from politicians and tried to ensure this was a voting system designed by citizens, that's not what's happening this time around. Yes, they took some citizens' input, but the decisions are being made by politicians. The Citizens' Assembly fully detailed all the rules of the system that we'll be putting in place. We knew all of the details. The only thing we didn't know is where exactly the writing boundaries would be. But the second time we voted, we even knew that. And the Citizens' Assembly went so far as to even define things like some of the structure of what the ballot would look like. So there was a complete detail actually being put out there on what we were actually voting on when we voted on the single transferable vote. That's not the case this time. There are actually going to be 3 different systems on the ballot, and you're going to be asked to rank which of those systems you prefer. And the details of those systems are not specified. There are particular details of how any of those systems work, which we don't know at this time. And certainly that includes, we don't know what the writing maps will look like under a changed system, but it goes further than that. There's many details of the system that are simply underspecified right now. Part of the reason for this is timing. The NDP has not had enough time between the election and now to fully detail out all of the system. However, I think a bigger reason is simply to try and help it pass. The issue is people get hung up on the details of a proportional system. And while they can be in favor of proportional representation more generally, they can be upset about the particular details of individual systems. And that's fair enough. These details are in many cases important. The consequence is that it's easier to pass a referendum that's vague on the details than it is one that's specific on the details. And that seems to be the strategy that they're pursuing here. The BC Liberals required that in order to be implemented, single transferable vote had to get 60% of the vote. It only got 58% of the vote, which is why it was not supported. They also required that it had to get 50% support across 60% of the ridings of BC, ensuring that the system was supported by province-wide support and not simply certain regions of the province. Now, this is a contentious issue. Some people think that the 60% threshold was unreasonable on the part of the BC Liberals, and it should have been 50%. They think the Liberals were actually trying to scuttle proportional representation by putting such a high standard on it. I'm on the side of thinking that it was reasonable to demand a higher standard. I think if you're going to do something as dramatic as changing our voting system, you do need to make sure you have consensus on it. And just barely one vote above 50% is kind of an unreasonably low standard. The threshold this time is 50%. 50% plus one vote will be sufficient to switch us to proportional representation. And there's no requirement for the system to be supported across the province. A further issue is that the previous referendums were held in conjunction with a provincial election, ensuring that everyone who voted in the provincial election also voted in the referendum. But this time the referendum is being done via a mail-in ballot. And these typically don't have great turnout. People don't send their ballots back in. And this is concerning because there is no minimum number of people who have to turn their ballots in order for this to be a valid result. This is made worse by the fact that we're currently going through municipal elections, which are distracting a lot of attention away from a really important referendum on the future of our voting system. In summary, two things are going on. One is that the NDP has this on a rushed timeline. They rejected calls to have, say, a citizen assembly because they said, well, we don't have the time to do that. We've been given too short a timeline. And I think the response to that should be, then pick a longer timeline. We shouldn't be rushing changing our electoral system. The lack of detail on what the proportional system will look like and the fact that we're holding a referendum now is part of the fact that they're simply trying to get it done quickly so that they can have it in place for the next election, rather than taking their time to ensure that they get the job done right. Furthermore, they seem intent on trying to get it to pass. They haven't set any high thresholds on it, they haven't put any details down which anyone would object to, and they've adopted the two-question referendum design from New Zealand, which successfully did pass proportional representation. Now, I think the situation is not good. I think the Liberals did a much better job of pursuing this than the NDP are doing right now. And it's to the point that some people who have defended proportional representation for a long time have indicated they can't support it under these conditions. I even found one person who expressed a conspiracy theory that the NDP is actually trying to scuttle it by being transparently awful in the way they're putting this referendum forward. That's too conspiracy theory for me to think is plausible, but I do think there is probably some division within the NDP caucus about proportional representation. We know that some people associated with the NDP, such as Bill Thielman and former Premier Ujjal Dosanjh, have come out against proportional representation. And it would be really surprising if there were no members of the caucus who felt the same way. And furthermore, polling data that we have, which is pretty sparse at this point, does suggest that NDP support for proportional representation has been declining since the last election. This leaves a question. Even if you, like me, support proportional representation in principle, should you support it under conditions of not knowing exactly what system is going to be implemented and where the party implementing it seems very rushed to get it in place before the next election rather than taking the time to make sure it's done right?